no one is going to pray for our kids like we will. They won't even pray for themselves the way that we as their parents can and will pray for them because oftentimes they don't even know what they
Right.
need prayer for. Hey everyone, this is Yvette Hampton. Welcome back to the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast. I am back today with Kelly Crawford, and we're talking about homeschooling. We're talking about the difference between school and education and how to take the stress out of homeschooling. And it's all the things that, we as homeschool moms have to think through and that we navigate on a daily basis. So we're going to talk more about that today. But before we do, I want to say thank you again to BJU Press Homeschool for sponsoring this podcast, because you guys, without our sponsors, well, we wouldn't be here talking to you. And I wouldn't have Kelly here on the other side of the camera talking to you and encouraging you as well. So thank you so much to BJU Press Homeschool. If you guys want help managing your homeschool on a day-to-day basis, BJU Press has a homeschool hub that can dramatically simplify things for you. You'll be able to see your child's workload, document grades, modify schedules, and more. The BJU Press Homeschool Hub is the resource you need for painless planning and happy homeschooling. Visit bjupresshomeschool.com to see how the hub can change your homeschooling. And now is a good time to do that. At the end of the school year, as you're preparing for next school year, check them out and see if that might be a good option for you for next year. So, Kelly, welcome back to the podcast. I am
Thank
so glad
you.
to have
Thank
you
you.
back. Yeah, absolutely. So you touched on something in Monday's episode. And if you guys missed Monday, go back and listen to part one of my conversation with Kelly. But you talked about you have a daughter who is in college and she is just a hard worker. She's very diligent. And I think sometimes as homeschool moms, we have this idea that all the other moms have it all together. All the other dads have it all together. And they've done so well in their parenting that their kids are all diligent. They're hard workers. They're amazing. And some of us are sitting back going, but my kid's not that. Like my kid is more laid back, relaxed. I wouldn't say necessarily lazy, but some kids are lazy. They're just by nature, they're just not go-getters. They're not hard workers.
Mhm.
With your kids, how have you managed to teach them to be hard workers? And I would imagine that with 11 kids, you have some who are maybe just not bent that way. God just didn't create them that way. Talk about your journey with that a little bit and what that has looked like for your family.
Sure, yeah. So, we've always, believed very important to teach our kids to be hard workers. There is so much of that that you can teach, and there is so
Yeah.
much of it that just, they are naturally inclined that way. I have both, like you mentioned. Some of mine just were naturally bent to be hard workers. We have to do 2 things. We have to be faithful. And so in terms of teaching character and teaching hard work, you give them responsibility, you give them instruction in that, you be an example of that, you praise other examples of that. There are a lot of different specific ways that we can teach that.
Sure.
But the other thing we have to do is remember that God has created all of our children very uniquely, very differently, with different strengths. And so we can't compare them to each other or to other people. I had one child in particular that was very difficult for us. And I won't go into a lot of detail, but it was just a long, difficult journey. And the things that I wanted to teach him, I just wasn't seeming to be able to impart to him. And eventually, I just continued to be faithful, and I prayed and I prayed and I prayed and I gave him to the Lord. And the Lord has done an amazing work in his life. And he is just a completely different person now.
Mm.
He ended up going into the Marines, and I think he learned a lot of good lessons there. But the Lord has really turned his heart. And, he comes home now to visit, and he will just go into the kitchen and start washing dishes. And he never, ever,
Wow.
ever did that before. So I tell people that to give you hope if you have one, because we had gotten to a place where a lot of times we had felt hopeless and like we had failed him, or had done something terribly wrong. But just trust the Lord with your children, because they were his before they were ours, and he loves them more than we do, and he has a plan for them. And our job is to be faithful. We don't need to
Mm.
despair, and we just need to the greatest thing we can do for them is really be prayer warriors for them.
I
So,
love that. Christy Clover talks about getting your knees dirty. And what
mm,
she means by that is to just get on your knees and pray. And
yeah,
that's through every part of parenting. I mean, no one is going to pray for our kids like we will. They won't even pray for themselves the way that we as their parents can and will pray for them because oftentimes they don't even know what they
Right.
need prayer for.
Right.
They might pray for, the next amazing thing that they want to happen in their life, but
Mhm.
they're not going to pray typically for their own character and their own development like we will as their parents. And so, what a great reminder that God is so faithful. And I love that. I love that you set that foundation for him and that the Lord was faithful to bring him to where he is today. And what a beautiful thing to have him come home and do
Absolutely.
the thing that, through all his years at home, you were trying to get him to do.
Yeah, it's been a real sweet gift, really, to watch the Lord work in his life, so hang in
Yeah.
there, mamas, hang in there.
And, it doesn't always turn out that way. But
Mhm.
still, our job is to be faithful, to do what the Lord has called us to do, to train them up, and to build character into them. And so I want to talk about that for just a minute, too. And you talked a little bit about that, but character in general, whether it's being a hard worker, whether it's being respectful, or whether it's being truthful and honest about whatever it is that's going on in their lives. How do you instill good character in your kids? What is your path to doing that as you're raising your kids?
Well, on a good day, if I can remember when, the Lord gives us lots of opportunities for teaching, and a lot of times that comes through things like conflict or,
Oh, yeah.
bad attitudes or those things. But if we can remember in the moment to not get so frustrated, but instead point them back to, let's take a look at why this is not okay or why this is okay. Go back to scripture and just say,
Mm,
if it's conflict with a sibling, you talk about that. You talk about displaying love and being tender toward one another and putting others first. And honestly, you have to remember that it's over and over. It's not a one
yeah,
time, one and done. I
right.
liken motherhood to a garden, and you don't just pull weeds one time. It is a process that you
Mm,
continue to do. And so that helps us not to get so frustrated. I've already done this. We've already talked about this, but it's over and over throughout their lives as long as we have them. And then you hope and pray that God, brings that to fruition in their lives and brings it around full circle. And those things begin to take root, those Bible scripture and those promises that you've taught them. So that's for me. And, it practically too, I like to read stories that have characters
mhm.
characters that, um, are noble and they can, because stories, we learn a lot when we hear
Yeah,
stories. Stories make things stick. And so telling good stories, reading good stories, that's another, the autobiographies, there are some great ones out there that, really help to form, I think, our children's character. So that's a
yeah.
practical thing that I like to do too.
Yeah, you say telling good stories, and I'm thinking, I am the worst storyteller
Yeah,
in all the land.
yeah, I was gonna say, just reading good stories
Right.
is good enough.
My stories pretty much always start with once upon a time, there was a princess named Lacey.
Yeah.
And she always rolls her eyes. Oh my gosh, mom. I'm a
Uh-huh.
horrible storyteller. I really
Yeah,
am, but
I
I'm
don't think
thankful
I
that
am.
others are good storytellers because I can just pick up a book and open it up and read it. And it is, I mean, whether it's stories from God's word or stories, biographies of people who've just done amazing things.
Mhm,
Um, it is incredible to be able to learn from other people. And what's so interesting about that is I think that so oftentimes those people, we read about their lives, like you read about Corey Ten Boom or George Mueller. I'm certain that during their life, they didn't think one day I'm going to put this story in a book and it's going to change people's lives, 100 years from now. Like that just didn't happen.
right.
But now we can go back and look at what the Lord did with them and in their lives, and we can just glean so much wisdom and character development from these amazing people
Mhm,
who were just ordinary people,
right,
just like you and me, right?
right.
And so God's faithful to use his people to continue, his faithfulness and his legacy that he leaves. So let's take a break. We'll be right back. We want to thank all of our sponsors for making this show possible. BJU Press Homeschool, CTC Math, Apologia, and IEW. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do this. Visit the show notes for links to these great companies and thank them for supporting the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast. We are back with Kelly. I want to go back to, did we talk about this Monday? I think we talked about this on Monday's episode. We were talking about um, school versus education, but what the difference is between being in a classroom and being at home. And you said that you were a teacher. You actually were in the classroom. You were an high school English teacher, and you had to kind of deprogram yourself from classroom, what the classroom looked like compared to what your home looked like. And this is so hard for parents. It still is hard for me. It's hard for every
Mhm.
parent, I think, unless you are a mom who just very naturally, and maybe you were homeschooled yourself, and so you weren't programmed to think that way. But I think most of us still kind of have that in us.
Mhm.
And so talk about how that has looked different for you and how you have just created less stress in your homeschool than what you had in the classroom. I mean, there are so many things, we look at curriculum and we always think we have to get to the end of this curriculum by the end of the year. We have to check all the boxes in order to call it a year and to call it successful. Did you feel that way in the classroom? And then how does that differ from what you have experienced in the home?
Certainly did feel had to do that in the classroom. And so one of the things I've tried to do as a homeschooling mom is just look at what the book or the curriculum that's in front of us is teaching and ask the logical question, do we really need this? Is this going
Mm.
to help my child become a better, student or better person? And the example that I've given often is even though I taught high school, and one of my favorite things in high school when I was a student was to diagram sentences. And it's in every English textbook. And I know that a lot of moms and a lot of kids get really stressed about this is just one example of diagramming. If you really sit back and ask the question, what's the point? I mean, what is the point of English? What are we studying this for? We're trying to become better communicators, whether that's
Mhm.
written, verbal, understanding language. And I just realized that diagramming sentences did not help me become a better communicator. Some people would argue with that,
Right.
but I would disagree with them because I did an awful lot of advanced grammar as a college student. And I really do not think that that helped. Like I mentioned earlier, we learn the English language at a very early age. And of course, we perfect it as we go, but we perfect it by using it, much like a chef learns to cook by cooking more than just by studying the molecules of the ingredients that he's using,
Right.
which is that's kind of what I feel like about diagramming sentences. And so I think a lot of times the classroom has to keep students busy. And so they use a lot of busy work. Another example I've given is, young children, young students, they are often given grammar worksheets where they are instructed to add an S to the end of the word to make it plural, add an ED to the end of the word to make it past. Whereas they've been doing that since they were 2 and 3 years old. You learn
Right.
as a toddler eventually the basics of grammar without ever doing
Yeah.
a textbook. So, you know, moms, if you could think about that and think, and it goes for other subjects as well. Those were just some examples, but asking yourself, do I really need to do this? I have
Yeah.
not done higher math with all of my children. I
Yeah.
I do I play each one by ear. I look to see, um, their interests, their gifts, if their propensity is in that subject. I've got a couple that have not gone on to do algebra. I've got some that instead of algebra or higher math, I've replaced it with the Dave Ramsey's curriculum, which,
Yeah.
if you think about, is probably a lot more beneficial to life in general than whether they can do algebra. So just
Right.
thinking logically about things like that, trusting what I said earlier, trusting the curiosity and the process by which God has created us to learn the things we need to learn when we need to learn them. If you
Yeah.
think about as an adult, how many things you've learned that you were not taught that have benefited you. It's we just need to kind of undo and unravel our predisposed thinking about schooling and see the bigger picture that would help us.
Yeah, I love that because part of educating our kids is teaching them to think well and to think logically through things. And so we're doing that in the process of teaching them, right? And that's such a great reminder because it's true. I mean, kids who are going to become engineers, they probably need to learn higher math, right? If you're going to become a chemist, you probably need to know the periodic table. But I never in my years of life have ever once needed to understand or know the periodic table. I
Right.
don't need to know all of the dates of history and every single thing that happened. Some dates are important to know, but some dates, who really cares?
Hmm.
It happened in history. It happened a long time ago. And this is where we are in the world today, but
And I would add that we live in a very different world now with the technology than we once
Yeah,
did, and so I think a lot of our what we're requiring students to memorize
right.
is outdated, if you will, because the
Yeah,
information is already there. Some people would
sure.
argue that it needs to be up here, but, not everything.
Yeah. Right, right. Well, and here's the thing is that, and we've talked about this lots of times, not every child needs to be a master of every single subject.
Right.
Because how many times have you met a scientist who's a historian or a mathematician who is an artist? I mean, like every kid, and you were talking about this earlier, every kid is different. God's created each of them with their own unique gifts and abilities. And so not every child needs to know every single bit of every single subject, right?
Right.
It's just not
Right.
necessary for life. And it really does put so much stress on us as parents. If parents want to parse out sentences with their kids, that's fine. It's
Mhm.
not that it's wrong to do that.
Just don't feel like you
It's
have to do it.
just don't feel like you have to do that. And as homeschool moms, especially if you've got several kids at home and you feel like, oh man, I have to teach every single one of them, every single thing about every single subject, you're going to go crazy. And so are
Mhm.
your kids because it's not possible. And, and I agree with you. I mean, I have learned more in my adult years than I ever learned. And I went to a good Christian school growing up,
Right.
but I came out of that Christian school knowing very little of anything.
Mhm.
And almost everything I know today has been things that I've learned in my adult life because I've wanted to learn them.
Correct.
And so our kids are going to learn. It's teaching them how to learn. It's not destroying their identity as being able to learn and being, children of the Lord, but
Right.
being
And I
who
do
God created them to be.
and I've reminded I've done a few conferences, and I always ask the audience, I say, "How much do you remember from your high school days?" And I'll throw
Yeah.
out some terms, who could define an intransitive verb right now? Of course, nobody can. And so a constant reminder to ourselves of that, it's
Yeah.
not the schooling that creates the person we become.
Yeah.
That's just such a small part of it. And another thing we can do is we can hinder our children from becoming what God designed them to be. And I've
Mm.
use my husband as an example of this because when he was growing up, it was, you did what everybody else did. You went to high school, you tried to get good grades. You had to get
Yeah.
into a college. Didn't matter if you didn't know what you wanted to do in college. That's just
Yeah.
what, you
Right.
did. And so he was in college for a year or two, did not know what he wanted to do, floundered around, ended up dropping out of college. He's now a very successful contractor and home inspector. He
Mm.
is very gifted at what he does. He is
Yeah.
he's in high demand from a lot of people, and he's thriving because that's where his gifts are. But it took him years and years to find that, and so many
Yeah.
years were lost. So many years and a lot of money was lost in the process. So we can do our
Yeah.
kids a real disservice by just expecting them to fulfill the status quo.
Well, I actually want to talk a little bit more about that and about how college really is overrated for a lot of people, not for everybody. College is for some, it's just not for all. So we'll talk about that. But we'll do that tomorrow because we're out of time. So,
Okay.
Kelly, what is your website again? Where can people find your blogs and find out more about you?
GenerationCedar.com. Cedar like the tree.
Okay, sounds great. We will put those links in the show notes. Thank you guys so much for listening. Visit our website, schoolhouserocked.com. You can find our merch there. You can find the movie. You can sign up for our newsletter if you've not done that, and just keep in the loop on what we've got going on here at the Schoolhouse Rocked Ministry. Thank you for listening. We'll see you back here tomorrow. Bye.
So I never planned on homeschooling. And in fact, our oldest daughter, who is now a mother herself, when she was about 3 years old, I put her in preschool because I thought that's what we did. When it came time to put her in kindergarten, my husband and I enrolled her in a Christian school because I went to a Christian school. And I think this is where parents, we typically do with our children what our parents did with us.
Ow, look, Annie. Something's wrong with you. Less is more. They like little bits. They don't like the big, huge handfuls because their mouths are so little.
We honestly started homeschooling kind of by accident.
I think it's changed pretty significantly. I think we're both far more on board than we were when we first started.
At first, I was completely against homeschooling. I felt like that kids needed to go to school to have proper socialization and proper education, and so I had really bought into that myth.
We got into homeschooling not because we wanted to. We're kind of the weird people. There's a lot of people who got into homeschooling. They always dreamed about it. When they were first pregnant, they were looking forward to homeschooling. Not us.
So I'm a little bit maybe unusual. We moved to really good public schools and then they let me down.
Call them accidental homeschoolers or reluctant homeschoolers. Their stories, like ours, weren't that unusual. So many of the families we met never planned to homeschool.